All right, this is lecture 19B. So I talked last time about the Chinese explorations and how they had sort of been interested in muscling their way into this really lucrative Indian Ocean trade network between east coast of Africa, the Middle East, India, and then around to China, and how they had all the tools there. They were all set up to do it, but they had decided not to. Well, the next player who tried that was the Europeans. Now, I mentioned before that after the Crusades, and especially after the 1200s, the Italians had, especially the Venetians and the Genoans, had begun to really push into European trade in the Mediterranean. And they had really come to dominate it. And they developed a lot of better ship technologies, and they became much better at contesting the Mediterranean with Muslims also. But that the rise of the Ottoman Empire had sort of challenged the Italians there. But it also, during this time period, the 1300s, 1400s, the Spanish had also gotten involved in the Mediterranean trade because they're obviously a Mediterranean power also. And so the Italians were sort of sometimes competing with the Spanish, sometimes helping the Spanish, sometimes competing with the Ottomans. But they were very aware that they were sort of always going through Muslim middlemen, right? If they wanted to trade across sub-Saharan Africa, they went through Muslim middlemen in North Africa. If they wanted to trade through the Middle East, they're going through Muslim middlemen in the Middle East. And then after 1453, when the Ottomans conquer Constantinople, then they're going through the Muslim territories there also through the Black Sea. So the Europeans were they were actually, as the Ottomans expanded in the late 1400s, they began to push pretty hard on the Italians and then later the Spanish, and really challenge them for control of the Mediterranean. And the Europeans were looking for some way to to bypass this. And so during the 1300s and 1400s, Europeans had actually begun to develop some pretty new technologies that helped them to develop better ships. Now, a lot of this stuff was actually borrowed, right? The Vikings had this great hull building techniques that other Europeans began to use, and Europeans learned about the compass from China, which had invented the compass, and Europeans began to experiment with sails and things like that, and so they began to develop slightly bigger ships, the caravel and then the carrack, which had more masts, and most importantly, they developed the lateen sail, which was on modern, if you think of it just somebody's regular sailboat today, they've got these triangular sails on them. That's a lateen sail. And if you think about the old pictures you have of Viking ships, they had this square rig sail. It was just a big rectangle, right? Well, square rig sails were actually, they really were only good for having the wind blowing directly behind you. They acted like a parachute. They caught the wind and held it, and it pushed the ship forward. But square rig sails were really not very useful as far as tacking into the wind or going across the wind or anything like that, which is why Vikings relied so heavily on oars, right? And a lot of the Mediterranean ships in the 1300s and 1400s had sails, but they relied more on oars. But with the development of this triangular sail, this lateen sail, the lateen sail works slightly differently. It actually works not like a parachute, but more like an airplane wing, in that when the lateen sail, the wind is blowing over the sail, and the wind going over the outer side of the sail is actually moving faster because of various aspects of physics and air pressure than the wind going on the inside of the sail. And what that does is it creates a partial vacuum on the outside of the sail, and it pulls the sail forward. So the sail is not being pushed by the wind from behind, it's being pulled by a partial vacuum in front of it. And the lateen sail is interesting because it allows you can't go straight into the wind with a lateen sail, but you can go pretty close. And so you can tack from side to side and sail into the wind, and the wind is actually pushing you forward even though you're going basically into the wind. And so the lateen sail was a huge advantage. And Europeans began to experiment with all sorts of square sails and lateen sails and all sorts of things like that, and the ships got bigger and they started to add 3 masts. And so by the late 1300s, 1400s, they were starting to get ships that were pretty ocean-worthy, and they could handle not just the Mediterranean, but they could even handle something like the Atlantic Ocean. Well, beginning in the 1420s then, the Portuguese began to say, well, you know what, if we've got these ships that can handle the Atlantic, and they knew they could handle the Atlantic because European fishermen were going out into the North Atlantic all the time, right? And so they knew they could handle the Atlantic now. And so they start to say, well, maybe we could find a way to bypass the sub-Saharan Africa trade and bypass the Muslim merchants in North Africa by going around them down to sub-Saharan Africa directly. And so they began a series of explorations. And one of the things they had to do here is they had to figure out navigation, right? Now they'd learned about the compass. They've got the compass now, and the Vikings had always navigated by the stars and all sorts of the light, and the Vikings had really bizarre sort of mystical ways of navigating. But Europeans began to realize that they could really use astronomy to calculate latitude, which is how far away from the equator you are, how far north and south you are. Because the stars, if certain stars are directly above you, then you're pretty far north. But if they're right on the horizon, then you're pretty far south or something like that. And they began to realize you could use the North Star to always tell you the north if you needed that. And so they began to get a lot better at navigation also. And they also invented the astrolabe. And the astrolabe was this great device for measuring the heights of stars and figuring out your latitude calculated on the astrolabe, which is a great invention. And so beginning in the 1420s, they began a series of explorations. And one of the people behind this was a Portuguese nobleman who's called Henry the Navigator, although he never went anywhere. He simply sponsored all these explorations because he was really interested in establishing trade with sub-Saharan Africa. So beginning in the 1420s, the Portuguese began to move down the coast of Africa, and they have to. One of the problems they have is wind currents, because of the rotation of the Earth and warming from sunlight, etc. There are some pretty established ocean currents in the Atlantic, and north of the equator, they tend to go clockwise, right? So the wind currents, say, starting from England, head south until you get to just above the equator, and then they go west across the equator, and then they start to head north when you get over the Caribbean and Latin America, and they go up the coast of the United States to the north, and then when they get up by Greenland, they curve around back to the east towards England again. And so at first, the Portuguese are like sailing down the coast of Africa, and they got the wind at their backs. Oh, this is great. Except that how do you get home again, right? And so they began to figure out that you could head south along the coast of Africa, but then when you got to the equator and you wanted to get home again, you would head out away from Africa and you would catch these winds and sort of ride around on the carousel, and it would drop you back down on Europe. Now, they're not going on the big carousel all the way out to Americas or whatever. They're doing a little loop to come back around. But when you get south of the equator, that gets harder, right? Because now the winds are headwinds when you're traveling south. But they realize then that they can start to sail out into the Atlantic, and that the winds in the south of the equator go counterclockwise. And so if you want to go down the coast of Africa, you're then gonna turn out into the middle of the Atlantic, and it would take you farther down. Well, this works. And so the Portuguese began to go farther and farther down the coast of Africa. And by the 1440s, they had reached the South Sub-Saharan Africa. They had reached modern-day Ghana and Nigeria and places like that, and they were starting to trade. And then by the 1460s, they had gotten down to Angola and Namibia and places down there. And then finally, in 1487, the Portuguese explorer Bartolomé Dias, makes it all the way to the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. And he realizes that if he keeps going here, he can get to the Indian Ocean. However, his crew didn't want to go any farther. They were worried about all sorts of things like dying. So they made him turn around. But 10 years later, the Portuguese funded a big expedition. An explorer named Vasco da Gama loads up a ship with a bunch of basically money and provisions, and he sails down. He follows Dias's path down to the southern tip of Africa, and then he keeps going. And he goes up the east coast of Africa, and he winds up getting to India. And when he's in India, he takes this money and he buys an enormous quantity of spices, a shipload of spices. And this was huge. And then he returns in 1498. He gets back to Portugal, and spices were so expensive at that time, so rare and so hard to get, that a shipload of spices was worth an absolute fortune. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe even billions of dollars in today's dollars. And so Vasco da Gama's expedition is a fantastic success. And the Portuguese are like, oh my gosh, we're going to get rich off of this. And so now the Portuguese have a way of not only trading with sub-Saharan Africa for gold, for slaves, for ostrich feathers, for all the stuff that they get from sub-Saharan Africa, but now they can also sail to India directly. They can cut out the middlemen all over the place. And the Portuguese then start sending ships regularly into the Indian Ocean, right? They start trading with the east coast of Africa. They start trading with, going up into Egypt and into the Persian Gulf. They start trading with India, and they start looking around and saying, well, how can we establish trade networks here? And they needed some bases, and the Portuguese basically decided, beginning in the early 1500s, that one other thing they realized is that their ships were bigger and heavier than most of the ships on the Indian Ocean, and that they had better cannons. And because their ships are bigger and heavier and were built better, their ships could carry heavier cannons and bigger cannons, because firing a cannon on a ship causes enormous strain on the ship itself. And so the Europeans realized that they could have heavier cannons on their ships than the Muslim merchants could have on their ships, and that they actually had some advantages in terms of how fast their ships could go, and et cetera. And so they realized that they had this huge, essentially military advantage. And so the Portuguese decided that what they were going to do was they were not just going to start trading with the Indian Ocean. They were actually going to conquer trade in the Indian Ocean. They were going to take over enough bases in the Indian Ocean that they could use their superior ship technology to force everybody who was trading on the Indian Ocean to pay them fees for protection on the Indian Ocean and to use their trading ports, etc. And so the Portuguese set out on this fantastic expedition of conquering ports and cities and fortresses on the Indian Ocean. And they set out, and they do some amazing things. I mean, they have some amazing success. They start capturing cities along the east coast of Africa, and then in 1511 they capture Malacca, which is a city right in Malaysia into Indonesia on the Straits of Malacca, and that gives them a huge control over all trade from China to India, because almost all of it passes through the Straits of Malacca. And they negotiate some bases in India, and they really try to totally control Indian Ocean trade. But it doesn't work in the long run, because Portugal has a population of a few million, and they're trying to control the trade of China, which has 100 million people, and India, which has, I'm not sure what the population is, but it's got to be at least 70 million at that point. And then the east coast of Africa, which is pretty densely populated, and then the Middle East, which is pretty densely populated. There's just no way they have the manpower for that. There's no way they can pull up. They've got the military advantage, they just don't have the people. And so the Portuguese would try throughout the 1500s to dominate Indian Ocean trade, and they would be attacking, this Muslim ruler and this ruler in India and, this ruler in Indonesia, etc. And they would have a lot of successes. And they would establish a whole bunch of trade networks. They'd establish trade bases over in China, and even make contact with Japan, and they're trading in India and the east coast of Africa and all that. But they can't control this. They can't get a monopoly. They can't control the Indian Ocean. Muslim traders was simply they started to set up overland trade routes. They started to develop better. They started to copy European style technologies for their ships, etc. And so the Portuguese tried to control it, but by 1600, they had really just lost control of it. They couldn't do it. And in particular, in the 1600s, you began to see other European powers like the Dutch and the English and the Spanish start to push their way into the Indian Ocean trade also. And so the Portuguese pretty much just become one European player amongst others. And I'll talk much more about the impact of the Age of Discoveries in the next lecture. And so in the next part of this lecture, I'm going to talk about the discovery of the Americas.